Hello again. Welcome back to Huntsman's Copse. Today we'll be exploring the rest of the area and maybe taking a look at some of the other spells that we've acquired on our journey. Let's go with Iron Flesh and Force. This is more for demonstration purposes than anything because these spells aren't particularly useful right now to us. Also, it helps to equip the proper catalyst if you want to cast miracles. Force is a very simple miracle, and it doesn't do any damage, but it does have some uses. For instance, you can more or less stun lock lighter enemies, and sometimes even push them off the edge by just spamming Force. It's a spell that requires a certain kind of environment to be useful, but if you find that environment, it can be very deadly. Our next leg is mostly solid ground, so let's go ahead and switch that out for something else. Heavy Soul Arrow is, somewhat obviously, a slightly stronger version of normal Soul Arrow. It has less uses and it fires a bit more slowly, but it does much more damage. Now, the Bandit's Knife, which we were using last episode, does have a bleed function that I will finally be able to show off. Most of the enemies here are simply too weak for the number of hits to be inflicted before they die, but there are a couple of exceptions. Daggers and similar weapons can be very strong if you upgrade them. However, in their basic forms, they're pretty weak. I'm gonna try and snipe this guy from across the way, but here we run into a bit of a problem with magic sniping. Elevation can really put a damper on what you're trying to do. As you can see, even though I'm staring straight at him, due to the way that the ground is sort of uneven across the gap, all of our soul arrows just sort of go flying right past him. This large guy is an artificial undead. He looks to be more or less stitched together from parts of smaller undead, and he wields two very fearsome hooks. He is also quite strong. His attacks do a lot of damage, and he can take quite a bit of punishment. Fortunately, because he can take quite a bit of punishment, we finally get to show off what happens when you bleed an enemy. They lose a pretty good chunk of their health, and you can hear a faint heartbeat noise in the back. As a rule, bleeding is not especially useful, so let's put the Bandit's Knife away for now. Try something different. The upcoming area can be a little difficult, so switching back to the Fire Longsword will probably help quite a bit just because it's such a trusty and versatile weapon. As you progress in the game, you will soon find that while the stuff you find later on might be fancier, it's not always stronger than the stuff you find in the beginning of the game. The longsword is, quite frankly, one of the best weapons in the game, simply because it has a very strong attack pattern and reliable CC scaling for strength and dex. The artificial undead are not hugely difficult, but their hooks have a lot of reach, and in this area with all these trees to maneuver around, they can hit you without too much trouble if you're not paying attention. They're also fairly vulnerable to ranged attacks. But every enemy has vulnerabilities. For instance, I have vulnerabilities getting clipped while I'm rolling. Let's try out Iron Flesh. Now, Iron Flesh greatly increases your poise, armor, and general resilience. But as you can see, it has a downside, too. When used, you start to move very slowly. If you use it prematurely, like I just did, there's a perfectly good chance that you will simply run out of the effect before you even get into range. In conjunction with heavy armor and high natural vitality, Iron Flesh can essentially turn all fights into a sort of brawl DPS race. It's useful for that kind of build, but you can't even roll while you're Iron Fleshed in most cases, so be careful when you use it. It won't protect you from all kinds of damage. One has to wonder exactly what the purpose of these little domes are. They look almost like prisons. But why somebody would put prisons in the middle of the woods, there you have me in deep water. As you expand your arsenal and start using spells if you are so inclined, do try to remember what and what you do not have equipped. A shield and a staff are both useful articles, but hardly interchangeable. Undead rogues, aside from just being generally quick, do like to try and ambush you. Other varieties of hollows tend to fight you just directly up front, but rogues in particular like to use positional advantages and ambushes. Pulling that lever will lower this kind of anachronistic looking drawbridge. It's almost as out of place as that large, ominous-looking structure that we just looked at. Soul Spear is an extremely powerful sorcery. However, it requires an incredible 40 intelligence to use. So that's something for quite a bit later in the game, if ever. I'm not sure that I will ever spec high enough into intelligence to be able to use that. You'll also note that it only had 2 uses. That is something of a weakness of high-level sorceries, and spells in general, is that you can only use them once or twice before you're out, and you either need to eat an amber herb or something or rest at a bonfire. In the interest of keeping things fresh, let's switch back to the mace. There's a bonfire and a fairly well camouflaged guy behind it. However, the door is locked, so we need to go exploring. Now, I sort of kick myself for unequipping Force at this point, because the next series of battles will take place along this very narrow stretch of cliff. So having something that would just knock these guys off in one shot would be pretty helpful. However, it's not really worth going all the way back to the bonfire for. So, for now, we'll just have to make do. There's a bit of a fork here, one way going up and one way going straight. Up here, we find a crystal lizard. Unfortunately for us, this crystal lizard is extremely sensitive to people approaching. Some you can get almost right up behind before they notice you, and others will sense you coming from half a screen away. This might have to be one that I come back and get off camera. Crystal lizard drops are fixed, so I would not feel particularly guilty getting it while not recording, and it would not be very interesting to see me reload over and over from bonfires to try and get it. When hunting crystal lizards, your best bet is a large weapon like the Ultra Greatsword that has a strong overhead swing that will hit the ground. As we saw back in No Man's War, crystal lizards have an annoying propensity for just sort of evading attacks by virtue of being tiny. The only way down from there safely without backtracking is simply jumping on top of a group of rogues, so it's not all that safe to begin with. Unless you really want that poison moss I just picked up, going back is the safer option. Given how easy moss is to acquire from the butterflies, it's really not worth it. Now, the spear will help us out quite a bit, because it's basically tailor-made for situations like these. Its long reach and long reach and lack of lateral distance to dodge makes it a very accurate and devastating weapon on this narrow walkway. Now, Merciless Rowena can be a very difficult encounter for a bunch of reasons. For one, the narrow walkway can be just as much of a bane as a boon, especially if you're not wielding a weapon like a spear. Also, as I'm aptly demonstrating, Rowena's scythe will completely cut through shield defenses. Fortunately, Rowena is not especially tough in terms of endurance, and if you're persistent and don't get overwhelmed and keep trying to do the wrong thing by blocking, you should win out. The boss is behind that waterfall. However, there's still that cave system we need to explore, and we should also go ahead and unlock the door to that bonfire. Now, like Vorgil the Sinner that invaded in Belfry Luna, Rowena is a scripted encounter. She will always invade you there, regardless of whether or not you're actually online. It is an NPC, not another player.
Who are you? I thought you were that bastard for a moment. You've set me free. Now I can find him. The cheeky prick. He won't know what hit him. Creighton of Mirror. I travelled from land to land to hone my blade. I've heard this land was full of danger. I thought it would suit me perfectly. I joined forces with a man on the way, but he was no more than a backstabbing knave. He took the first chance he had to try and off me. I decided to set a trap for him here. But then I got trapped myself. I can't believe that I was so dense. Thank the stars that you came along. You be careful of him. Pate, I think he said. He wears this rather unusual ring. You know it when you see it. I've seen his type before. He kills entirely for the pleasure of it. I'm sure I won't be his last victim. The man's better off dead. I tell ya. He's a slick talker, so don't let him fool ya. Pate, the man with a strange ring. Watch out for the slimy rat. And don't you believe a word he says. I'll find the common foot bad and put an end to his roguery.
Well,
Pate, I'll find...
that sort of cast a shadow upon our previous interaction with mild-mannered Pate. However, it's still entirely possible that this was based on a terrible misunderstanding. After all, Pate was kind enough to warn us of the closing door behind us, so it's entirely possible that Creighton just sort of got ahead of himself and thought that he tried to get killed by Pate, but really didn't. At any rate, with this bonfire lit, we can now explore a little bit further afield without worrying about having to backtrack too much. Inside the cave is an interesting new quote-unquote enemy. These laughing curse jars will, unsurprisingly, curse you if you get too close to them over time. Now, if the curse bar fills up, you will essentially go hollow one stage and lose a bit of maximum health, as well as lose any of the being human benefits. So, for something that doesn't actually do any damage to you, they are very dangerous. The mace we just picked up is infused with magic. That means it does less physical damage, but in exchange, it does some magic damage on hit and scales with intelligence. I would say that the greatest weakness of curse jars would be the fact that you can just sort of roll into them. Now this doesn't look good. I've been too busy talking about curse jars to mention the fact that there are a bunch of skeletons here trying to kill us. These skeletons are special. You might notice that when we kill them, we do not actually receive any souls. That is because further down the path, there is this lovely necromancer who insists on bringing these guys back to life. Now, with the necromancer dead, we can deal with the skeletons, more or less, but it turns out, oops, there's 5 of them. This can be an incredibly nasty trap. Fortunately for us, the necromancer will not respawn, so we can more or less proceed through this area normally. Skeletons are much easier to deal with if you don't have to deal with 5 of them at once. I'm going to switch back to the normal mace because it's upgraded a little bit. We don't have enough intelligence to really take advantage of the magic scaling. Now, an aside about environmental hazards like curse jars. You'll notice that that one came back. They follow different respawning rules than enemies do. If you destroy them and rest at a bonfire, they will not actually respawn. However, if you destroy them and then leave the area, or die, or cause some sort of stage transition, then they will come back. Skeletons are actually quite skilled at parrying your blows, so be aware of both invaders and the position that skeletons are in when you attack them. When they're holding up their shield like that, there's a good chance they're about to parry. Now to deal with the Dark Spirit. This guy is an actual player and not a scripted encounter. No way out this way. Dealing with dark spirits, or hosts if you're invading, can be difficult because it's difficult to tell where they are a lot of the time. Sometimes you can see their health bar for brief seconds as you sort of traverse the area, but that's not very reliable. Now, Herbert Todd here is probably a new player. I'm not saying that because they're bad, it's because they're making a particular mistake that you should never do in PvP. And that is, hold your shield up for no reason. If you simply have your shield up by default, you're very open to guard breaks. And guard breaks, sequentially, make you open to critical hits. Now, an aside about invasions, the host usually has an advantage, because the host can use Estus flasks. However, when I'm not in a terrible hurry or in dire need of getting to be somewhere, such as on the way to a boss when I'm recording, I will usually try and play fair and not use Estus healing. It's not against the rules, because there are no rules, it's just something that I like to do. Because I have been on the other side of the coin many times myself, and having to deal with hosts that just spam Estus Flask can be really annoying. At least until you pick up a good supply of Lloyd's Talismans, then it's kind of funny. Now, to access the other part of the skeleton cave, we need to sort of circle around here. Merciless Rowena will not respawn. Scripted invasions are one-time events only unless you use a bonfire ascetic or you're on a New Game Plus cycle. On the other side of the cave is more skeletons. The Necromancer is not only capable of raising skeletons, but also sniping at you with magic. I would like to refrain from comment from that embarrassing spectacle, but I will just say that you should be aware of your surroundings and not voluntarily back yourself into a corner. The only other way for me to go in that situation was straight to the bottom of a pit. So don't be like me, and perhaps don't put yourself in such a situation. That's one of the weaknesses of shields, by the way. With Spear and Shield, you might feel largely invincible by using the block plus R1 combo. However, your stamina is not infinite, and when more than one enemy starts hitting at you, things can turn very dicey very quickly. There's also the consideration that spears are very ineffective against skeleton enemies. What are you going to stab? The hole between their ribs? Don't get cocky just because you've beaten back an invader. Complacency will probably be the cause of your death more often than anything in this game once you start to become experienced. Rogues drop a variety of useful tools, such as throwing knives, poison arrows, as well as their equipment, and I think life gems occasionally. I would not say that they are especially worthwhile to farm, but if you come here early and you want some extra advantages in the range department, it might be worth it. Back in Cave Skeleton, let's try this and not die. With the right weapon equipped, the skeletons go down much more quickly. Something to note about backstabs and other critical hit animations in this game is that the invincibility frames you are granted are not total. You can still take damage while backstabbing, riposting, or shield breaking somebody. I'm not entirely sure why, but that's just the way of things. I do not recall that being the case in the first game, but it's entirely possible they changed that at some point. That necromancer was hiding upon an isolated platform, so our options were either take him out from afar or jump over. I was feeling a little less brave after my last death, so I decided to take him out with Fire Orb, which is like Fireball, but orbs are stronger than balls. At least, that's what I've been told. Now, I am fairly confident in my ability to take on this boss, especially because I can use heal to get myself back up to full. However, before we do, I want to switch out weapons yet again, and switch to the large club. This devastating weapon is actually extremely effective for boss fights. At this point in the game, I don't really have much better to equip than the Silver Serpent Ring, so let's get going. These are the Skeleton Lords. In addition to looking like a Megadeth cover album, they will fire fireballs at you and attack you with a bunch of spooky-looking weaponry. There's 3 of them, but generally speaking, they are not so deadly that it becomes an issue. They are also, like all skeletons, incredibly vulnerable to striking damage. However, they do have a gimmick. While the Lords are not tough individually, when they die, they sort of send their souls out and possess all the other bones that are laying around to create more skeletons. So for that reason, it's important that you don't simply kill all of them at once and then get overwhelmed by the minions. Be methodical, take your time, be sure to retreat if you feel you need to, and most importantly, I think, do not kill the Skeleton Lord with the big bony staff first. Or second, save him for last. The reason why will become apparent as soon as we do off him. He's easy to differentiate from his brothers because he is especially fond of throwing fireballs at you. If you're feeling vindictive, you can knock down their bone thrones. Or, they almost look more like lifeguard spots, honestly. They're sort of silly looking. In the interest of saving some durability, I finished that guy off with a fire orb. Now, the fire orb spitting skeleton lord will spawn these bone wheel guys. And as Dark Souls veterans might know, these guys can be absolutely terrifying if you let them. Fortunately, since we saved them for last, they were not a threat. But they will start rolling around the battlefield like crazy, and it is quite possible to get locked in between one or two of them and just get stun-locked to death. In addition to souls, we also get this free falchion as a bonus prize. Lemongrass sells falchions, but as I always like to say, nothing is better than free. Since our large club has just broken, I think it might behoove us to switch to something that isn't broken, like our new falchion. There's another huge iron bridge here. It's really quite a mystery why these are simply dotting the landscape. Or more importantly, who has the technology to build these things in an ostensibly medieval setting? Yes, very, very gorgeous view. I feel like that if we really tried, we could still climb up that, but, you know, gameplay. Welcome to Harvest Valley. However, we've had quite a bit of a journey getting here, so I think we'll have to leave this for next time. After resting at a bonfire, I think we need to take some time, collect ourselves, and mourn the loss of the Skeleton Lords, the best boss fight in the game.